Imagine what it felt like to be a middle-aged biologist or natural historian in 1869. So 10 years after the publication of Darwin's Origin of the Species. Evolutionary ideas had been in the air before then, but by and large had been rejected or ignored by people working professionally as natural historians outside of perhaps Germany. Most established natural historians, including those who trained you, had seen their work as being about cataloging a stable creation. By the 1870s, however, evolution was widely accepted amongst professional scientists, to the extent we had professional scientists in those days, although the principle of natural selection, the mechanism by which this happened, was not yet widely accepted, and indeed wouldn't really be finally accepted for about another 50 years. But by this time, the job that you had been trained for, maybe 15 years earlier, 20 years earlier, had changed radically. Its purpose was no longer to catalog a stable nature, but to understand the mechanisms that underlay a dynamic process. The plants and animals that you studied were now interesting not so much for their relationship to each other, as much for their relationship to each other as for their intrinsic qualities. And perhaps most importantly, your students were both interested in different questions than you had been, and they saw their careers in a different light. They were interested now in questions of how, not what. They saw themselves as biologists, not natural historians. And they introduced new methods, such as, for instance, the use of statistics. They became people whose work involved the application of completely new techniques and brought in stuff from other disciplines, such as, in fact, statistical analysis, observation of large and heterogeneous populations, in order to pursue these new questions. The disjunction that's felt by our middle-aged biologist is known as the Darwinian divide, the near-complete disjunction that existed between pre- and post-origin of species biology. Prior to Darwin, natural historians did one thing. Within a single career, you had now biologists who saw themselves doing something completely different, and something, in fact, that their training hadn't prepared themselves for. And I raise this today because I think we in the humanities are going through a similar Darwinian moment as a result of technological and disciplinary changes that have happened in roughly the same amount of time, 10 to 15 years in our particular case. This is a moment of fundamental, rapid change in methodology and epistemological goals. And just as happened in biology in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, this change is affecting more than our method. It's changing what we study, it's changing the institutions that support changing the institutions that support this study. In other words, the humanities, as it is now practiced, is undergoing a process of fundamental change. A change so that 20 to 25 years from now, it will no longer look the same, at least in my opinion. Its position in society will be different. How it is practiced is different. The self-definition and the interests of its practitioners will be different. And the reasons why students will study what we teach and why governments and private corporations will support what we research will have changed as well. Now, this is part of a larger trend that is affecting other parts of the academy. For example, the sciences are also affected by some of the changes that I'm discussing here. But the effect is going to be the greatest in the humanities because the change in our area is the least incremental. In other aspects of the academy, digital technology is modifying or extending or otherwise incrementally changing the practices, but in the humanities, it's fundamentally redefining them. Now, these are big claims, and frankly, they're claims that are so big and so vague that they're going to be trite if I'm not careful how I phrase them and what I say. And so I'm going to have to ask your indulgence as well for some, hopefully not too wild, but nevertheless relatively speculative comments. And I'm also going to end up really, in a certain sense, just presenting a snapshot of three aspects of this radical transformation that I think is happening, to really sort of just give you a flavor for the change. But there's many, many more aspects in which the digital is radically changing both the practice of the humanities, but in case of my talk, its institutional context as well. But I do think it's important also to note that there is something that ties them together. So the things that I'm talking about here are not simply randomly chosen. There is a technique or an observation that ties them together. And it's one that I haven't seen anywhere else, at least used in this particular context. But I do think goes a long way to explaining what goes on, and I think can also be used to predict future trends. And since I've never seen it, actually, I've seen this idea before, but since I've never actually seen it applied to this problem, and since I otherwise live a very boring life, I decided to call it O'Donnell's law. And that law is that the non-trivial application of computing to humanities research always involves a consideration of first principles. And I'm going to explain on that in a second, but let me put it in different words, that computers require us to develop principles that can be then used algorithmically, that is to say deductively, elsewhere, and this happens in what is otherwise an inductive field. Now, since this terminology may not be familiar to everybody here, let me just explain myself a little bit. In the sciences, we tend to work from deductive principles. That is to say, we work out a hypothesis, some kind of explanation, a generalizable approach, which is then used to predict what will happen to data elsewhere. In the humanities, we tend to work inductively. That is to say, we see some kind of feature in a specific case, which we then generalize outwards to try and explain how other things work. We all know how this works in the case of our PhD theses, for example. A very typical English department PhD thesis is some idea found in 3 books with a conclusion. And then that's considered, in our case, enough then to have got a PhD. In the sciences, that would normally not be the approach that would be considered sufficient for a PhD, since that would just be 3 cases. And what you would need to do instead is have some kind of set of rules or laws that you could then use to apply to something else. And so this observation that when you apply computers to an aspect of humanities studies, that it forces you to go back to first principles is a very non-trivial thing. And I'm going to give you one example. This is something I've been thinking of for a while. And I'm going to give you one example that those of you who study literary study will know. And that is to say, the critical apparatus at the foot of a page. When I was doing my edition of Cadman's Hymn in 2005, published in 2005, it was published in print but also in a digital format, and it was done using TEI, SGML at the time, not XML. When you make a print edition of a text, the critical apparatus at the bottom of the page is where you put your textual variants from all the other witnesses. How you make that is not very important. You basically choose the readings that interest you, and you put them there. If you're computing it, on the other hand, you have a really difficult problem, and that is to say, what is the apparatus? Is it notes? Is it a list of readings? What is it that it does? How is it related to the main text? And so in my case, it took me actually almost 6 months to try and figure out what the apparatus at the bottom of the page really was. In fact, I published an article ultimately in Literary and Linguistic Computing on this. And the argument that I came up with, it doesn't matter in great detail, was that the edition is a database and the apparatus is a database view. Now, the point of that story is that it took me 6 months to do something that if I wasn't working with a computer, I would have just typed out at the bottom of the page. And the implications of what I did, in my view, was then generalizable to other cases in a way that had I been working in print never would have been. Nobody has ever published an article about what the apparatus does at the bottom of a print page, but working it out electronically produced actually new scholarship. So this is in fact quite an important point, and it happens across the board. When we start using computers, we have to go back to first principles, and we end up working inductively to get to our first principles, but then deductively to generalize them elsewhere. So computing allows, but in fact indeed requires, the humanists to generalize in ways that were simply never possible before, and certainly never required before. Now, for the rest of this talk, I'm going to look at largely institutional and organizational manifestations of this. And I should indicate a little bit about this slight difference in focus compared to how we normally talk about this. Because we are humanists, by and large I assume in this room, and many of us are digital humanists, we tend to be very interested in the methodological implications of what we do. That is to say, we're very interested in how some technique that somebody else has developed will impact our own studies. How can you take what I've done with the critical apparatus and apply it to your own work? How can you take the TEI and apply it to something that you've worked out? But what's been really striking to me in the last few years, as I've worked a lot more with scholarly organizations and infrastructure, has been the extent to which this same principle, the same process, is also affecting the social structures with which we work. And so what I'm going to look at today is not really what we do with computers in our domains, it's how we do it in our domains and how our domains are funded and organized and how that is changing in response to the digital turn. And in fact, I think in the end, what we're going to see is the real difference that comes in the future is, of course, with our studies, but the place that will be most shocking if you were to go fall asleep for 20 years and come back, the place where you would be most surprised at what's happened is in how we're organized, not necessarily how we're studying. And so let me start by pointing out one institutional difference that you may or may not have realized or thought about right now, and just because it's so close to us. And I should say, one of the interesting things about these institutional differences and changes that are coming is they're hard to see because they're right on top of us. So one of them is this gathering. That is to say, a meeting that is bringing together people from a variety of disciplines, institutions, linguistic backgrounds, countries, and even hemispheres. Now, some of you share backgrounds with each other. You may be interested in the Portuguese language, or history, or culture. Some of you may share with people here that you work together in libraries, or in history departments, or in letters departments, literary departments. But there's two things to that. First of all, others don't work in these places. And secondly, we have historians and librarians and literary professors all in the same room. So, for example, I'm an Anglo-Saxonist by training. I live and work in Canada, and I'm a professor of English. So what am I doing here? Whoa, it's too fast. Well, obviously, as Maria-Claire noted in the introduction, I'm actually not here because I'm an Anglo-Saxonist. I'm here because I have some experience that's relevant to this group. That is to say, work that I've done in leading scholarly societies. Digital Medievalist, Global Outlook Digital Humanities, the Canadian Society for Digital Humanities. And I hope I'm also here a little bit for some work that I've done in my discipline itself, that is to say, editorial work or scholarly communication. Although if you think about it and you look at that list there for a second, it is an odd list to be invited to Brazil to speak to a group that are thinking of forming a Portuguese language digital humanities society if you focus on the domain area. I've worked with medievalists. I guess Global Outlook works with people all around the world, including in Brazil. And I've worked in the Canadian Society for Digital Humanities. So I'm not down here because of the domain of these areas. I'm down here because of the generalizable process involved in setting these up. So would I have been invited 15 or 20 years ago, before the digital turn? And the answer is, I wouldn't have been. And why not? Well, that's because 15 years ago, That is to say, before there was digital humanities, in the term digital humanities, the only thing that would have been interesting about me would have been my domain work, my linguistically and culturally specific work as an Anglo-Saxonist on the medieval period, the text and textual editions of 6th to 12th century England. This is fascinating stuff, but it's simply, I suspect, something that most of you are simply not interested in. And just so you don't feel superior, I wouldn't have cared less what you guys were up to either 15 or 20 years ago, because I was interested in Anglo-Saxon England, nothing to do with the letters, the history, the culture of Brazil or of the larger Portuguese-speaking area. So, in other words, the reason we're meeting here today and that you're listening to me has to do with this deductive turn that's been brought to us by computing. This ability to inductively reason down to a set of first principles, that is to say, how do we organize people in the digital humanities, and then extend it back out as a set of principles that we can apply to our work, in this case, in the case of the opportunity to think about a Portuguese language digital humanities society. And we're talking because my experience using computers to help organize the study of European and especially early British culture has allowed me to develop generalizable lessons that can then be applied to the organization and study of Brazilian and Portuguese language and culture, not because I organized medievalists or Canadians. Before the advent of digital humanities, and in this case the possibilities for using social media for further disciplinary studies, we would simply have had nothing to talk about. That is to say, the globalization of the humanities is only possible because of its digitization. And that digitization of the humanities has created a methodological common ground, one that's generalizable enough to allow people to work across linguistic, cultural, and disciplinary silos that 15 years ago would have kept us apart. As some of you know, because I've spoken about this, my father was a physicist, and one of the things that always fascinated him was the difference between the humanities and the natural sciences. And one of the things that he pointed out, he had a number of things that he really enjoyed. One of the things that he enjoyed was if you attend a physics conference, physicists talk to slides and don't read. If you attend a humanities conference, the people who are supposedly good with words read and don't talk to slides. And it always struck him as odd. He would have imagined that the people who were, let's say, their job was linguistic facility would be more comfortable speaking ad lib, and the people whose job was numbers would be less comfortable. Of course, the reason why that is true is because, in our case, the precise words that we use tend to be more important. And so we want to make sure that we've said them exactly right. But another thing that really interested him was culture. The people who are in the humanities, we tend to study culture. Culture is a human universal. And yet we never, at the time, this is 15, 20 years ago, we never really talked to each other. If you were an Anglo-Saxonist or if you were an English professor, you knew nothing about what was happening to people who studied French or Portuguese or Spanish, and that we lived for a group of people that were interested in culture. We lived very narrow lives, as opposed to, for instance, people in the sciences then, where they weren't constrained by culture, but they worked across the boundaries. And so one of the things that's happened with the advent of the digital to the humanities is it's managed to break that down. I'm going to come back, there's a problem with this. I'm going to come back to it later on. But it's managed to break us out of these silos where we used to work. We could be working on the very same problems, but because person X worked on Spanish literature and person Y worked on English literature, with the exception of a few large theories that affected how we all work, from deconstruction 25 years ago, new historicism, cultural materialism, that worked in many, many places, with the exception of a few things like that, we tended to work entirely in different traditions. German textual critics work differently from English textual critics. English textual critics work differently, to a certain extent, from American. And we didn't really connect. And so this globalization of humanities study through the common interest in digital methodologies is not a small thing. And it's something that really has come up in the last 15 years. A second institutional manifestation, I'm sorry, I've skipped a couple of slides there. That always happens. A second institutional manifestation of the digital, and hence I would argue fundamentally a deductive thing, a turn, has to do with the popularity of the digital humanities with funders. And I believe we'll increasingly see industry. This is actually something that my wife pointed out to me in the context of my father, at the last MLA conference, so the American Conference of the Modern Languages Association. There was a panel about, was it too easy to get funding in the digital humanities? And my wife turned to me and said, could you imagine a physicist saying that? They would never happen. But at any rate, it's an ill-concealed fact that the digital humanities is by and large better funded than the traditional humanities. There are special programs for digital projects and infrastructures. Deans will give us money to set things up. We've heard about aspects of the Ministry of Culture with a special program on digital things. There are joint interagency initiatives like digging into data. There are private foundations that are interested in funding our work. And none of this is true of the traditional humanities. There's no digging into Shakespeare program, for example, being jointly organized by the NEH and the AHRC and SSHRC. The Canadian Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council allows funding applications to self-identify as being relevant to the new digital economy, but it has no equivalent program for Dickens studies or even for national literature and history. They're interested in digital things. They're not interested specifically, SSHRC is interested in humanities work, but they have no special programs for subdisciplines in the traditional humanities. So, why is this? Well, one reason is it has to do with the generalizable paradisciplinary nature of the digital humanities. If the NEH and the European Science Foundation and the AHRC and SSHRC were to offer a digging into Shakespeare program, it would privilege a single author. If they said digging into the Elizabethan period, it would privilege a single period. And it would be privileging a very limited range of disciplines, presumably literary studies, maybe some history, drama, that would be it. By offering a digging into data program, these agencies are able to fund projects without having to pay attention to their disciplines as long as they share an interest in data mining, some kind of similar methodological interest. So it is a way of distributing money to humanities projects efficiently and fairly. But there's more to it than that, because if the digital humanities simply made it easier for if the digital humanities simply improved the efficiency of humanities research, we wouldn't expect to see this kind of government and industrial interest. When people complain that the humanities have no place in society or that the governments shouldn't fund them, why is tax money going to fund literary studies or history? They're not complaining about that because they think it's inefficient. They're complaining about it because they don't like the subject. It's not because they wished it was easier to give money to the subject. And in fact, the reason why there's such interest in funding the digital humanities is because the funders think, and governments particularly, that digital humanities makes the humanities generalizable and especially extensible. That is to say, it is understood by governments, and I think not incorrectly, as being a way of leveraging the humanities for more than personal interest or fulfillment. But rather, it's seen as a way of capturing the very real skills that traditional humanities education has always delivered in a way that is useful in a non-abstract and quantifiable way in the larger general economy. When we train our students in digital humanities, we train them to take the humanities training, which, as we've always said, is useful for people in the real world in a way of allowing them to think broadly and to make connections that perhaps are not quantifiable and not obvious. And we've turned it into something that is actualizable in the real economy. And that's why governments and funding agencies want to give us money. In other words, while we're interested in digital technology, we as digital humanists, because it allows us to do different things in our subject domains, governments, funding agencies, the general public are interested in funding us because they see the skills that we teach our students as being something that is of more general application than our subject area. It's a generalization, let's say, of the power of induction, so to speak, something that could be used in the larger economy and a way of actually capturing the investment that has always been made in the more traditional humanities. Great. I want to go on now and talk about a third. And as I said, I'm just talking in broad terms right now. I'm going to come back and talk briefly, very briefly at the end, about some of the problems inherent in what we're talking about here. But I want to go through let's say, the positive case first. So the third, and for today, the final institutional manifestation of this Darwinian divide between the pre-digital humanities and the current digital humanities in the digital age, or digital humanities, has to do with the question of peers and the public. That is to say, who is it we work for when we do digital humanities? In the traditional humanities, the distinction was very clear. You had peers, and peers were people who they worked at universities, and they had trained in your discipline. And then there was the public. And the public were people who didn't work in your discipline and were outside the universities. And some of us wrote stuff for them. Most of us didn't. Most of us wrote stuff only for our peers. So some people would write special studies for them. In the case of the digital humanities, this distinction is far less clear. And that's because we now have multiple disciplines that we work with. So in some sense, this gathering is an example of that. 15 or 20 years ago, unless you had a multidisciplinary topic, some aspect of the study of a problem in some period that could be looked at by literary scholars, linguists, and historians, you would never have literary scholars, historians, linguists, and librarians in the same room. Nowadays, on a digital humanities project, it's extremely common to work with that range of people. I was saying at lunch yesterday that before I finished as I was finishing my first edition, my edition of Cadman's Hymn, before that time, I had never worked with a librarian except as a client. That is to say, I'd gone to the library and I'd asked for advice. Since then, I've never worked on a project that hasn't had a librarian as a research partner. That my librarians are now, I can't do what needs to be done, and that's why we have librarians doing things like metadata, helping with semantic definitions of things in ways that 15 years ago I never would have asked. I would have asked them where a book was, or I would have asked them to help me with an interlibrary loan, but I would have never had a librarian on my research team. The team I currently work on the Visionary Cross project, has got a computer scientist, a librarian, 2 Anglo-Saxon literary scholars, 1 art historian, and 2 computer scientists who do computer visualization. I can tell you that none of my supervisors ever worked on a team with anything like that range of expertise. My supervisor, Fred Robinson, who's quite a prominent Anglo-Saxonist, first of all, never co-authored an article in his life, and secondly, never really worked with anybody other than other Anglo-Saxon philologists. It never happened until very recently. And the second reason why this peer-public distinction is much harder to nail down in the digital humanities has to do with the fact that the, quote, people trained in those disciplines are not always found in the universities anymore. Again, 15 or 20 years ago, it was pretty obvious where you found your peers. They were, if you were unlucky, assistant professors. Otherwise, they were associate and full professors. But the point is, they worked in the professoriate. And who your other peers were, well, they weren't quite peers, but your proto-peers were the students that you trained, your graduate students. And that was basically it. But nowadays, not only do you work with librarians, computer scientists, who else did I say, art historians, you also work with people who may share your disciplinary background, but are in completely different kinds of jobs. So library is sort of the oldest of these, what we now call alt-ac positions, but there's lots more of those people now, especially in digital projects. So you end up with people who work, for instance, in the university computing center or computing wing. You have people who work in instructional technology. You may work with people who run special projects. And the same is true of those fields. So, for example, a very common position in libraries nowadays is the digital humanities librarian, many of whom are not librarians. They are people with PhDs in English or in history or literary studies or cultural studies who have been hired by libraries to support digital research because libraries are also understanding their jobs as being quite different. So we have, first of all, we now work with multiple disciplines. It's no longer, our peers are no longer those people who've been trained in our discipline, and they're no longer the people who work in universities as professors necessarily. And then the third part is they can also be the public, because in ways that simply wasn't true, in a way that simply wasn't true 15 or 20 years ago, the public is now much, much more engaged with our work. And there's two reasons why that is. One reason is because our work is way cooler. There's simply no other way of putting it. I work with a 3D scan of an Anglo-Saxon cross. We scanned this thing and we've got it on the web in a secret spot you can't see yet. But nevertheless, the people in the village where we scanned it, they love this thing. They love playing with it. They love working with it. And so the public are engaged with our kind of work in ways that never was true before. When I started at the University of Lethbridge 17 years ago now, I think, I was more digitally engaged than most, and I would occasionally get an email or a letter from somebody asking for advice. A television company once asked me for advice. But it was probably once a year, twice a year maybe. Nowadays, anybody who works in the humanities who's got any kind of online presence, certainly in my case anyway, I get stuff probably not quite once a week, but I'd say every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks, I get something from the general public emailing me asking for advice for stuff. Sometimes it's stuff I don't know anything about. Somebody once sent me a photograph of a chair they bought because it had Old English writing on it, and they wanted to know if it was valuable. I don't know. But the point is that the public is much more engaged with us now. They feel the right to contact us. And then secondly, we use the public in ways that we used to never use. Some of the most fascinating work that's happening right now in the humanities has to do with crowdsourcing. That is to say, when you have large bodies of text that we need to get converted to something, how do you do it? Well, you engage the public. I'm sure we know many of these projects. The Bentham Project is one of them in England. Peter Robinson, who's at the University of Saskatchewan nearby, has restarted the Canterbury Tales Project, something that he worked on about 15 years ago, as a crowdsourcing project now, which is to say he's putting photos of Middle English manuscripts up, and he's got a new mechanism by which you can crowdsource the transcriptions, and people do, both in class, through classwork, but also just the general public. Now, this has actually always been done in the humanities, but it's never been done quite so commonly and quite so centrally. When I say it's always been done, the Oxford English Dictionary, for example, is a famous example and an old example of crowdsourcing. That is to say, all the historical readings. The Oxford English Dictionary is a dictionary of historical principles, and its definitions are based on samples from readings. And those samples were collected by the general public, including a murderer who was in prison. He wasn't convicted because he was insane. But he was actually the largest contributor to the Oxford English Dictionary. So we've always done it, but now it's a much larger part. So when we talk about peers and the public in the digital humanities, it's much harder to figure out who's who because our peers are different and our public is often our peer. So this is changing our relationship to what we do in relation to these two groups. It's causing us to question the former quite rigid hierarchy that saw scholarly dissemination as being more important than popular dissemination. Now, those of you who are active in the digital humanities will know that this is something that certainly the younger generation of digital humanists have been pursuing for a number of years. That is to say, using blog publications, seeing popular dissemination as being important, collaborative writing, making sure that contributors to projects get proper accreditation. But I think it's important to notice the extent to which it is now beginning to creep into official recognition as well. So it's not happening at universities yet. I was told when I went up for when I went up for promotion to full professor, that nobody ever got promoted to professor for contributing to the Wikipedia. I had written the entry on Cadman in the Wikipedia, and it had gone through the peer review process, and so as a dare, I put it on top of my publication profile. I made it through, but I don't think it was because of the Wikipedia. But now I just finished a grant for the Canadian Social Sciences and Humanities funding agency, and since the last time I applied 3 years ago, knowledge mobilization, that is to say, how are you going to take your work and make it useful to the general public, is a key criterion for success in the program. And so the Canadian Granting Agency, and the second aspect now is also training. So the Canadian Granting Agency is now asking us explicitly, what are we going to do with our work and how is it going to be made public? So the day is coming when this is going to be more important. And I think also that the associated rise in novel forms of publications, such as blogs, public lectures, exhibitions, not to mention novel forms of actual dissemination like open access forms of publication and collective publication, is going to put pressure on our internal evaluation systems as well. So, like, for instance, peer review. How is it, if granting agencies are starting to accept, or in fact require, popular dissemination, how is it that promotion committees are going to handle popular dissemination activities? In the past, you may as well not have done it because nobody counted it. But now that, in fact, it is a key criterion for getting funded, in Canada at least, they're going to have to change because people cannot not do popular dissemination and expect to get funded. How do we peer review material that's being crowdsourced? When Peter Robinson crowdsources his editions of the Canterbury Tales and he publishes it, what is it we peer review? Who is it we send it back to for correction? And in fact, this is becoming an even bigger issue with projects like the Digital Karnak project coming out of UCLA's Urban Simulation Lab. I'm engaged in a project with them right now where we're doing a study of the vetting process for public material. This is a really interesting group. This is the group that did the digital interactive exhibit for the Temple on the Mount in Jerusalem. And they do popular reconstructions of historical sites, one of them being, in fact, the Egyptian temple complex at Karnak. And it was put together by Lisa Spear, who's a friend of mine, and Lisa Snyder, sorry, who's a friend of mine, and an English professor there who's an assistant professor and needs tenure. And so what they're now doing is they're publishing this popular edition of the temple complex at Karnak with Anvil Press, or at least they've submitted to Anvil Press, and Anvil Press is working with Digital Studies, the journal I edit, to comment on the review process, because if you think about it for a second, they had a fair bit of funding to do this. A referee can no longer say, nice idea, but I think you got to redo the entire infrastructure, because that funding's gone. And so what is it that a referee can referee even when you have projects that are so expensive they can't be replicated, is one of the places where pressure is coming on this old system. And then finally, how do we live with resources like the Wikipedia, but also blogs and other activity that is useful, but is being produced completely outside the academy and the traditional academic ecosystem? I have a student, and he and I, we haven't started work on it, but we really want to work on an essay called On the Shoulder of Trolls. And the point of this article is that nowadays when you do research, some of the weirder but more interesting stuff, especially on relatively esoteric topics, is happening in blogs run by people who there's no way they would ever get tenure. And so we need to distinguish what's good and what's bad about their stuff, but my student's point was it's not all bad. And we don't have an evaluation system yet for dealing with the efforts of good-willed amateurs, crazy good-willed amateurs. This question, this last question, peer review, is our survival of the fittest. That is to say, like our middle-aged natural historian back 10 years after Darwin's book was published, we've accepted that things have changed. We know that globalization has happened. We know that there's no reason for historians to be afraid of literary scholars and vice versa. We look stuff up in the encyclopedia, even if some of us tell our students not to. But exactly how this is going to work in terms of our peer review processes, our economic reward systems, we don't really know that. We don't know, the natural historians didn't really accept yet the mechanism by which natural selection or evolution was occurring. And in fact, it would take them about another 50 years before it would be completely and widely accepted amongst professional biologists that natural selection was the mechanism for this. And we're very much the same way in terms of questions of peer review. We know things have changed, but we don't understand how to work with it yet. It's clear that something new is required to support these changes that are happening in our field. There's no way the Wikipedia is going away. There's no way young scholars are going to stop blogging, and there's no way they're going to stop blogging good stuff. And so we need to have some way of accommodating for this. But it's difficult to see how we're going to do it. And in the case of peer review, change is difficult because of the inherent conservatism of the academy. Everybody's scared that if you give tenure to somebody because they've done work at the Wikipedia or because they're a good blogger, that you will be laughed at because you're not as good as Harvard. And so one of the problems that we have is we simply don't know how to get past our fear of having hired the wrong person at the moment. But the final result, it does seem clear that the change is going to have to come, and that the final result will not be the same model that was developed for our disciplines in their pre-digital days. And in fact, that whatever we come up with is instead going to have to work with a newly globalized, useful, that's an unusual thing, popular work that we're doing now. And we have a model for what's happening. Now, so we don't know the solution to this, but we do actually have another model, not just the biologists, to tell us how things might look. And that has to say what happened to the librarians. Because the librarians are very similar to us, but they have their own Darwinian divide, and it's a little bit earlier than ours, and it's a little bit more thoroughgoing. And so, in our case, I would argue, speaking as a digital humanist, that our Darwinian moment is the moment we decided what we did was called the digital humanities. We were talking about this the other day at lunch. When it was humanities computing, that looked like a technique that you did two humanities stuff. Once we called it the digital humanities, we changed our view as to what it was we did, and we were talking about doing the humanities in a digital context, and it radically opened up, in fact, the things that I'm talking about now, which are not so much computer programs, but the digital context in which humanities research takes place. In the case of the libraries, and I'm not an expert, so I know there are, so perhaps they'll correct me, I would say that this issue happened a little bit earlier, and it had a slightly different cause, and I would date it to the browser wars in the 1990s and the tech crash in 2000. And this is just my potted history, but I think what happened was, and I remember the Library of Congress at the time, was very concerned when you had Netscape and Internet Explorer battling over the different browser standards. They were very concerned about the nature of the investment. If we were going to put our patrimony online, what would happen if it turned out it worked best in Netscape and not Internet Explorer? And so there was a very heavy drive towards promoting standards. The XML standard came out around about the same time, around about 2000, which again I think was in fact a major impetus for how the libraries worked. They had different issues, but they had similar and probably even greater disruption. So the world of there too, it's not clear yet, I don't think, how this is entirely going to play out in the library world, but I think they're a fair bit farther down the path than we are, in the sense that, in my experience at any rate, the people who are in management in the libraries have pretty much internalized that this is the way the field is going, and many, many librarians have as well. There are some librarians who haven't, but that's in a certain sense because they're like me, like our middle-aged natural historian 10 years after the publication of Darwin. They're dealing with stuff that's happened inside their training curve, and they're finding it difficult. We don't know how it's going to play out yet, but it's certainly it's moving along. And it's clear that if anything, the changes there have been radical and even more all-encompassing. So our model for what's going to happen to us, I think, we can look at the librarians and say, not there, but with the grace of God, go us, but there, in the grace of God, go us. That raises now the last point that I want to raise, which is I've been talking really about the positive side of things. I don't have time to go into the negative side of things, but it's worthwhile raising some negative aspects to the things that I've been talking about simply because we can already see that they are major issues. And one of them, in fact, if you're on the Global Outlook Digital Humanities list, you will have seen it's a major issue as of right now. They were talking about it last night and this morning. So the first one is this globalization, which, as I've said, I think is actually one of the really surprising and really positive developments of the digitization of humanities research. Our ability to talk to each other across people who are trained in specific cultures and languages, to talk to each other across disciplinary domains. And the problem with that is it ironically reduces the diversity of expression. Because the research that we do when we talk to each other is conducted, by and large, in our lingua franca. And that is to say, in English. But the problem with that is, unlike, for instance, my father, the physicist, is everybody involved in the digital humanities was hired or is a student of the humanities because they are good in their native language. What they do is they study how the linguistics of their own language works, or the language they're interested in. They study the literature and the culture of their own country, of their own history. And so we have people who, as my father said, have been trained in how to use words, suddenly not able to use their words. Instead, they have to work in English. Now, that's all right for me, but it's not all right for most people. And in fact, as I've been saying in a number of different fora, including on Global Outlook, it's actually also not all right for English speakers either, because what we need to learn to do is talk slow and talk international, which again is difficult. I was hired as an English professor in part because I'm good at making puns and cultural references that are, fun and hard to get, especially if you're not an English speaker. But I got to turn that off. So one of the ironies of this is we get this incredible richness of running into each other, and then we got to turn it off because nobody can refer to the things that make their field special. How we deal with that, I don't know. It's coming along as a real issue on digital, as I said, on Global Outlook, Digital Humanities. It has been, in all the years that I've been anything to do with the board at ADHO, it has come up more and more and more and more insistently. There isn't an answer yet, but it's definitely a problem. And then the second one is this fact that we're getting funded. And as I said earlier on, only humanists could worry about whether or not funding is corrupting them. But nevertheless, we should worry about whether or not funding is corrupting us. And that is to say, it's very easy if you're in the digital humanities, and I've heard people do this, to dismiss the neoliberal attack, or the attack on us as being really neoliberal utilitarians. And what we mean by that is, in our emphasis on the good that we do, on the transferability of the skills that we have, on how our students can take what they learn about their humanities subjects and what they learn about the digital and be useful in the real world, we have to be careful that we don't privilege usefulness over the other stuff. That we don't, in fact, say the only stuff that's worth doing is stuff that could be funded by digging into data. And when I was making fun of the Shakespeare people, that's bad. We shouldn't be doing that. We should, in fact, be saying, why isn't there money to do Dickens work or Shakespeare work or Brazilian literature work, even if it isn't digital? And one of the things we have to watch out for, because the way the funding is set up, the reason our deans like us is because they see the training as being the purpose of what we do, not a side benefit. And one of the things that we've got to watch out for is that we don't end up training our students to not pay attention to, in fact, the difficult, non-extensible, non-economically valuable humanities research that we do. So I've raised these two questions, and I think that these are, in fact, questions of this new world that we've entered into. But to go any farther than just mention them would be a completely different talk. So what I hope I've left you with now is an understanding, or at least a glimpse, of how I see that we are changing in response to the digital turn in the humanities. Although, like our middle-aged biologist back in Darwin's day, I've got no idea how it's going to work out. I just know it isn't at all going to be what it was like in 1858. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Thank you so much. So now we have a short time for questions. Temos tempinho para perguntas. Eu vou chamar a Bruna aqui, talvez. Bruna? Você está aí. Não, então é a Cris. Cristiane, quem tem alguma pergunta, ela leva. Levar aqui também. Porque, senão, eu tenho uma pergunta. Vou começar com a minha pergunta. Já tem ali? Tem mãos levantadas? Fiz? Tem? Isso, depois eu deixo a minha pergunta. Obrigada.
Thanks for your speech, for your talk. I'm willing to address a question about the last 2 points you put it on the screen, and I want that you explain a little bit more of this negative, of this dark side of digital humanities, especially because I'm really worried about not only these two aspects, but also the question of the machine being more and more close to everybody. So, for instance, iPad, it's a device that you don't know how it works at all, and you cannot access the machine, and you cannot understand the machine. So we are also a part of the process of the actual computing, the source, whatever, inside the machine. And this can be a process of transforming the computer or any device, electronic device, in something that we cannot interact directly and reflect upon and think about as humanists. That's the point. That's my question. I want you.
Okay.
If you
I'm going to actually ask you. Sorry, could I ask you a question back before you hand the microphone away? For these two, so I'm going to pick up on the question of the closed technology. But for these two, particularly, what are you interested in there?
About these two,
Right.
Especially in the first one.
Okay, so how to deal with that, I guess.
Exactly.
Okay. So let me deal with the second question first, that is to say the closed technology. We were talking about this earlier in the context of our students not necessarily wanting to code and how hard that can be. And we talked about, just a bunch of us sitting around, we were talking about ways of getting students interested in this kind of work. And a couple of people had a similar experience to mine, which is that students, if you ask them to code, just say, here, code, they're not interested in that. But if you talk about the digital context in which our work happens, so students are less interested in humanities computing than they are in the digital humanities. But once they're involved in the digital humanities, in fact, the coding aspect becomes more prominent. Now, you weren't asking about coding, but the reason for saying that is something that I've been doing is, and I suppose this is our get out of jail free card with the neoliberal, the attack on digital humanities for being a sort of neoliberal utilitarian thing, is we can train our students to be aware of that, to essentially be critical digital humanists. So one of the things that I do whenever I get a graduate student, and if any of you are interested in coming up and working with me, this is an advanced warning on what will happen, is one of the very first things I do to a new graduate student is I give them an old computer and I tell them to go put Ubuntu on it. And the reason is I want them to see the blue screen of death on a Windows computer, and I want them to get past it. I want them to, that screen where it comes up and says, you're going to wipe out your hard drive, is that what you want to do? And ideally what I want them to do is I want them to mess it up. Because what I want to show is that it's only a computer and we can always redo it. One of the best examples I had was with my current MA student who's just finishing, Heather Hobma. When she started working on Digital Medievalist, I gave her a task. There was something wrong with Subversion. And so I said, just erase this file. And it turned out it wiped out all of Digital Medievalist. Now, fortunately, Digital Medievalist is on a 24-hour, it goes once a day, it updates, and our production machine is separate from our work machine. And so we had about 8 hours to try and fix it. But nevertheless, the point was just get used to the idea that computers are like that. What I do in a larger context is I actually also, I get the university usually to install Linux on just a Windows computer for us in the classroom, and I get the students to boot up in that, not necessarily because I'm a crazy Linux person, although I am, but because I want to get them away from the idea that I have a Windows 8 box or I have a Windows 7 computer. This idea that every time a computer changes, you have to buy a new operating system, or every time you buy a new operating system, you have to have a new computer. And so really encouraging people to actually get their hands dirty. I think some of the work that's going on with Makers Labs now are really, really exciting in that regard, because you're taking, literary students and you're saying, go make something. Break it apart and look at it. And I think that actually we are probably the hope in that regard, in that we can take our students and show them how to bust stuff. And that's the only way forward, because, otherwise they keep warning you that your warranty will be voided if you unscrew this thing on the back. So I think teaching people to hack, which is something that we do a fair bit, is the way around that problem. This problem, I don't know. And as a native English speaker, it's a little bit difficult for me to comment on it because I don't feel the pain in the sense that for me, speaking English is what I do. The hard thing for me is to turn off being a sort of fluent native Canadian speaker of English. However, I do think that the way it's been working on Global Outlook has been really interesting. One thing that we have managed to solve there a little bit is the translation issue. And we also have, to a limited extent, I think, not solved the lingua franca issue, but encouraged an alternate. And that is to say, what we've done at Global Outlook, the bylaws have just been approved by the executive. They're going to be published to the list. If I had a decent internet connection, it would have happened on the weekend. One of the things we say there is that Global Outlook doesn't have a language. It doesn't have an official language. Now, most of the traffic on that list is happening in English, but we've been relying, first of all, there has been some stuff happening in Spanish. I'm on a couple of discussion groups, including the one that led up to this conference next year in Mexico, where the discussion was held entirely in Spanish. And, you know, I can kind of pick my way through Spanish. I had to write back in English. But I liked it because what we were seeing and what we're seeing to a certain extent is not pushback, but a belief that we can speak other languages and do this. And then the people, everybody is, you know, has to figure out a way around it. So I do like at Global Outlook the way that people are not afraid to use their own language when talking to other people and it makes sense. The other thing that's been very interesting at Global Outlook has been the question of translation, which, as I'm sure people know, is murder, right? How is it that you get stuff translated? And what we've been doing is, we've got a rule, it doesn't work 100%. As far as I'm aware, for example, there's no Portuguese translations at all. But what we've been doing is we've been saying to people, we work on a voluntary basis, and we ask people, if you see something in a language that you know, that you think would be important for other speakers of some other language you know, by all means, translate it or summarize it or whatever. And we have seen people doing that. So, for example, Barbara Bordoleo and Alex Heel would occasionally, especially if the traffic was very fast on the Red HD conference that's coming up, they would every so often put out an email where they summarized the discussion for me. I mean, I could pick my way through, but if there was multiple emails a minute, as I'm sure most of you know, or many of you know, you get headaches trying to follow a fast discussion in a language you don't know. And so I had, people were translating. And that's worked remarkably well at Global Outlook Digital Humanities. And I'll say one last thing actually about GoDH that's been interesting. And that is, if you think about it, GoDH is a recipe for fights. Because what we've done is we've got a group that takes people from all sorts of different linguistic contexts. We discuss the differences and the problems that separate us, and it's run by an English-speaking Canadian male. And the opportunity for misunderstanding, for trouble, is just immense, and it hasn't happened. Now, we've come close, but nevertheless, I've actually been just really surprised at how well it's worked. So I don't know if it's an answer. It may be a model for a way in which people can get together, in essence, by recognizing that sometimes people are going to speak their own language, and then it's up to the people who speak the lingua franca to try and figure out what they say, and that's okay as well.
Maybe if the lingua franca is Chinese, you will feel the pain as well. But this may take some time.
Right.
But I have another question about the skills of digital humanities. You told us that your students are skilled not on special fields, special subject fields, but they are quite for fields they can use for the economy of the country and so on. Then the digital humanities are very general, are not specified to any subject. And in an academy, I think it's necessary to have specialists on the computer knowledge and the subject fields. And I don't really understand how we can deal with on the field digital humanities. It is only a method or an approach, a general approach, or is it more specified to special disciplines?
Right. So the question was, when I'm making claims for the digital humanities as being an economically useful skill set, how could that be if the point is that it's a generalizable set of techniques and tools and we're not training specialists and the economy needs specialists? There's really two parts to that. One is I would disagree with your premise, which is to say a good friend of mine who's actually just retiring this year at the University of Lethbridge is in the management school, and he ran the Management and Information Studies program. So that is, Management Information Studies is basically digital management, where you train management students in digital techniques, really, but more specialized then. So these are the actually they're not the digital, these are real sort of like the computer scientists of management. And at the same time, he researched this. And one of the interesting things is we've actually just closed the program. And one of the reasons we closed the program is business was not interested in computer specialists. They were interested in generalist managers who understood IT. And so, in fact, and then to give a little bit of historical context, one of the back ideas that I have here is, why is it that people have felt for the last 50 years in North America, at any rate, that you need a degree? And why is it that they felt that the humanities were in some way a useful preparation for economic life? And I think the origins of that, apart from just simply grade inflation and demographic waves, has been the humanities used to teach the skills that you needed to succeed in business, which were how to write, how to type, how to research things in books. And in the last 15 or 20 years, that's changed in the business world, but it hasn't changed in the traditional humanities. And so part of the complaint that we get about our graduates when they come out the other end saying, these are not employable, is they have skills that would work, I'm going to throw in a television reference, in the Mad Men era, that is to say, in the world of 1950s advertising, but don't really work now. However, if we think about that original model and then update it to have digital skills, then all of a sudden the model works again. And all I can do is give anecdotal evidence of this, but the time before the last time I taught digital humanities, I taught the course, it was called Cyberculture at the time, and I had students do different kinds of projects, and they were being hired out of that class the way that nurses get hired out of a nursing program. Because what was happening was they were getting hired into the kind of jobs that English students get, that is to say, working as public relations people, working as the newsletter editor. But unlike the other kids, these guys knew how to handle the technology that does that. So, for instance, one woman in the class was hired by a national engineering company as the personal assistant to the CEO because she'd been hired as a summer intern to edit the newsletter, and he'd been sending her this thing every week as a Word file, and what he'd been doing was erasing it all and then typing it in again. And the file was getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and the whole thing was slowing down. And so she took him aside and opened up the Word file in zip and showed him that what was happening is when you erase a Word file, you don't erase anything, it just marks it as deleted. And so that everything he had ever typed was in this file, and it was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And he was so impressed that he hired her, because then the other thing she said is, why are we sending around a Word file? Why don't we just set up a blog? And the fact that she was able to do that, and it cost nothing, that's a kind of skill, that's not computer science level skills, but those are the skills that our non-digital humanities students don't have, but are necessary to leverage the traditional skills that they do have. So the ability to write well, the ability to read, the ability to do research, and it's just that the ability to function in a digital world, to understand that you can take the back off of the iPod, that kind of stuff is the employable skill.
Okay, so I was thinking, Daniel, about one last aspect that maybe it would be worth hearing a little bit more. When you said right in the beginning of your talk that you think for the sciences this turn has a different impact because it's an incremental change,
Right.
and that for humanities it's a radical change. It's a
Right.
change in the way we work. And how would you put the same reflection in terms of the knowledge communities that we have to create? Because there were two emphases in what you said. You said the globalization as in this aspect of the language that you said in the end brings us those challenges. But another challenge that you mentioned earlier was the challenge of breaking the boundaries across disciplines in the humanities.
Right.
So my question actually would be, why do you think it's a radical change, and how could this affect not only the frontiers between languages, but disciplines within the humanities?
Right, right. I'll address that. The question was compared to the scientists, where I said that the same changes are happening, but it's not as radical a change because it's more of an incremental effect. In the case of the humanities, where I've argued that it is more radical, let me just share. I've got this. How is it radical?
Yeah, how is it radical? Is it because of the breaking the boundaries between the disciplines?
Right.
Because this is what I understood.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if
I think the way to answer that is to discuss why it's not radical in the sciences, because then I think it's clearer why it's radical in the humanities. And it is true that some aspects of what we're seeing right now really are, let's say, their implications are quite serious for the sciences as well. One aspect is, for example, globalization. Globalization for scientists is something that has existed for quite some time, long before there was a digital enabling. And so they're already, first of all, they're quite used to the idea of working with people from other countries, because what they share is actually the science that they're working on. And they don't have the same problem where we have been deliberately and necessarily inward-looking, and all of a sudden we're forced to look outwards. Another aspect of it is, if you think about it for a second, digital, I haven't really mentioned it in my talk, but one of the methodological revolutions that I think is coming is citable data and open data in the humanities, but it's also true of the sciences, that this is revolutionary, but it's not radically revolutionary in the sense that scientists have always had to work with large data sets. Humanists, it's a new idea that we even have data, and that now we need to figure out ways of linking it and working with it. So in our case, in some cases what it is we have discovered the problem at the same time as the digital has made the problem more interesting or bigger or in some way speeded it up a little bit. The one place where it is an incremental change, but it has deep consequences for the scientists, and it does, I think, also have consequences for us, but not quite as serious, is reproducibility. I'm on the board at Force 11, which is an organization interested in research communication across all the disciplines, and the big issue in the sciences right now is the reproducibility of bench science. When you publish a report, it's been in the news about cancer, but it's true of all the bench sciences. When you publish a lab, basically none of it can be redone. We in the humanities actually, in fact, one of the reasons Force 11 exists is this idea that humanists actually maybe have something to tell, which is we're used to the idea of dealing with multiple variables in a reasonable way. And the reason why the scientists are finding it so difficult is basically what they're discovering is there are simply too many variables in a science experiment, and they don't know what they all are. So they think they've isolated everything, but then it turns out the humidifier was on, or a tram went by. And in fact, I was once at a physics conference with my father when this was before the Hadron Collider. They were looking for dark matter, and there was a report from a group near Sudbury or something, I can't remember exactly where they were, where they had a result which was either what they were looking for or a tram had gone by. And they weren't sure which one it was. It turned out it was the tram, not the result in the end. But nevertheless, they're not quite used to that. To take the question around the other way, and then so from the humanities perspective, I guess the question is really like, why is it radical? Yeah. I think the radicalness is simply that although we have always valued intellectual flexibility and valued sort of internationalism as things, the nature of our jobs have been to look inward and to focus on in fact, ever smaller areas, right? So it used to be, I said, I'm an Anglo-Saxon textual scholar. If it had been 40 years ago, I would have said I was an Anglo-Saxonist. If it had been 100 years ago, I would have said I was a medievalist. And if I was 200 years ago, I would have said I'm a man of letters, right? And so in our case, we've become more and more focused on smaller and smaller bits. That's been part of the professionalization of the humanities. And yet, all of a sudden, we have this countervailing force which says you may be an Anglo-Saxonist who specializes in early Anglo-Saxon texts, but you actually have as much or more in common with somebody who studies, I don't know, those Dung Dynasty Chinese prints in terms of your editorial questions than somebody who studies Middle English texts. And so I think what's happened is none of our institutions are set up to bring people who don't have the same cultural interest, but do have the same methodological interest. It's just simply not set up to bring us together. I can give one example of somewhere else where I think this happened, and I thought it was brilliant. Because I'm an Anglo-Saxonist, now this is an American thing. Hopefully it didn't play out here. But in the 1990s, in literary studies, the big thing in the States was big theory. And so we had, initially deconstruction, later cultural materialism. And as an Anglo-Saxonist, we were seen, philologists, we were seen as being to put it in their terms, the other. And so when you would go for job interviews, for example, they would say, so what do you think of theory? And it was a very hard question to answer because, as my supervisor said to me, it's like asking somebody, what do you think of air? Right? I mean, I don't know. And I think a really interesting development was Histoire du Livre. When the history of the book studies came along after that, it provided a meeting ground between high theory and textual philology that managed to elide those differences in ways that was simply brilliant. I really wish that I had been on the job market in the late 90s rather than the early 90s, because I think I would have had a much easier time explaining what I did in terms of book history than in terms of a fight over cultural materialism, deconstruction, and Germanic philology. And so I think that is the one model that I can think of for how this has worked in the past is that. And I do think, so it's not I've said that these are problems, but these are problems of richness. These are problems because we have touched on benefits that did not exist before. We just need to now learn how to handle them.
Yes. Okay. So I think we have to thank Daniel very much for his talk, and thank you all for the questions. Thank you so much.